Cupid's First Christmas by Tana Jenkins. All rights reserved by Tana Jenkins. Chapter 1, Theories, Mackinac Island, 1999. If the cold didn't kill him, nosy Santa Clauses would. "Whoa, easy there, Doc, it's slick," the elderly woman in a red and white stocking cap hollered from across Main Street. "Yep, I heard you the first time, Miss Parker," Zack muttered. Hopefully no one else had. His gaze swung past her to survey the row of colorful Victorian storefronts lining the road. Doubtful. She was small. Her voice? Anything but. Her boom had startled him from his focused effort to sidestep the black ice between his office and lunch. He straightened the lapels of his wool jacket and pressed the phone back to his ear, returning his attention to his call. "What's going on over there? Did you hear what I said?" his father demanded from the other end of the line. A combination of frustration and hunger had him speed-walking when he knew good and well that his athletic legs, honed to granite from years of basketball, were no match for the slippery patches of the quaint town's sloped walks. Frozen mists rolled up from surrounding Lake Huron, depositing the invisible ice everywhere. It posed a perpetual hazard, at least for him. The real locals seemed to navigate with ease. "Zack!" his father barked. "Yes, I heard you," Zack answered, arching a brow. "It doesn't seem like you've listened to a word I've said." As if that were even necessary. His father called several times a week with the same rant. He practically had it memorized. "Since you've taken over the practice, the numbers have been abysmal. I need you to fix this and fix it now." His father slammed down the phone. Zack stared at the blank screen in his hand. For 1 second, he fantasized that he'd been the one to end the call, to cut things off. For good. He dragged a gloved hand across his nearly numb forehead and slipped his phone into his coat pocket. The man was almost sour enough to ruin his appetite. After a snafu with the financial aid office, his dad stepped in and paid off a medical school loan. Each one of these calls tempted Zack to renege on the agreement to spend a year managing the family practice to pay off his debt. He reached for his headphones and frowned when he grabbed nothing but air. Right. His beloved CD player had been a casualty of his last slip and fall. Man, what he wouldn't give for a little jazzmatazz to get his mind back on track. Glancing sidelong, he saw Ms. Parker still standing there, one arm slung around a candy cane taller than her, watching him expectantly. Clearly, she was in the mood for a chat, which was the last thing he wanted. But the spot in his chest that always went soft for old ladies turned into gooey buttercake. Stifling a sigh, he called, "Good looking out, Miss Parker. Appreciate it." She beamed. "Any time, you know I've got my eye on you." Mr. Manning, 2 doors down, threw open his window and stuck out his head. "I hear shouting. Did someone have an accident?" He held his Santa hat with one hand and the ledge with the other. "You're always a day late and $1 short, you old fuddy. It's only Zack Albert out here doing his best imitation of a seaman." Ms. Parker mimicked Zack's earlier stagger. Mr. Manning laughed, the echo ringing up the road. "Yep, I always miss the good stuff." Zack shook his head. Certain more windows would soon open. He picked up his pace again in spite of the ice. Mackinac Island didn't just play the role of a small town on TV. It was the real deal. The gabled eaves, embellished with decorative trim, seemed to nod in proud agreement with his assessment. He glanced around at the smoking chimneys, sure signs of cozy fireplaces within, and then at the water, views that drew admirers from around the world all summer long. For all its charm, the island was a place where the peak of midday winter entertainment could be as simple as watching a hungry man walk up a snow-draped road etched with wagon tracks, as was currently the case. And the idea of being the center of that attention almost made him suck his teeth, which was a problem for a doctor looking to run a family practice. Strong people skills were a must. His were hit or miss, with a lot more misses than hits. "You should probably put some boots on those feet," Miss Parker shouted as she stuck the gigantic candy cane to the mint green column in front of her fudge shop. "Wearing those fancy shoes, you're liable to hurt yourself. Then you'd be a doctor needin' a doctor. Wouldn't that be something?" She laughed so hard she snorted, then laughed some more. "Yep, you're on a roll today, Miss Parker." He shoved his gloved fists deeper into his coat pockets, pulling his jacket tighter as he began the countdown in his head. 1. Like many of the elder sisters on the island, she never missed an opportunity to engage in what seemed to be a preferred pastime. 2. Whether he was grabbing tissue from the store, checking his mailbox, or even fixing a flat on his bike, it was always the same. 3. What you need is a good woman at your side. Yep, that was the line. The same one he'd heard at least 8 times a week in the month he'd been back. More, now that the holidays had arrived. No one in the quaintest Christmas town in America seemed to be able to stand seeing someone celebrate, or, in his case, not celebrate, alone. If only he could channel their concern into dollars for the office. Not that he didn't want to find a good woman. He did. Growing up the lonely only child of an emotionally distant father had left him sure of one thing: his desire for connection and a loving family of his own. But not here. After so many years away, being back on this huge block of ice that called itself an island reminded him of the most painful bits of his childhood. And he had a theory about pain. It was a heavy, living thing without feet. It possessed the brute strength of a wounded ox, but moved slow and blind as a natural-born mole. So if you kept your eyes open and your legs ready, you could outrun it. Leave it in the dust of the place where you found it, which is what he'd done all those years ago. But now that he was back, it was here, waiting for him. Larger even than he remembered, for it had been gorging on itself so many years that no matter where he went on the island, traces of it lingered. They were on the shore where his mother had taught him to skip rocks, on the cliff they'd raced to the top of after church on Sundays, and most of all in the eyes of the villagers, who all saw her when they looked at him. 1 year, he only had to last 1 year, pay off his debt, then he'd catch the first thing smoking back to sunny hot Lanta, where traffic stopped for a snowflake, and he could enjoy his life of comfortable anonymity, almost 1,000 miles away from the troubling memories. Shoot, maybe he could even patch things up with his ex. As if on cue, another Arctic gust howled up from the frigid waters of Lake Huron. It slammed waves against the nearby shore and sent eddies of wet snow whirling down from the rooftops, blanketing his shoulders. His teeth chattered, then his chatters chattered. Man, winter, of the Arctic variety. So not his favorite. And since Mackinac Island had long ago realized horses and cars were a bad mix, outlawing the latter, travel during winter left him exposed to a whole lot of it. He yanked his new scarf tighter around his neck, grimacing from the prickly fibers biting into his skin with nearly the same sharpness as the cold lashing through his socks. Miss Parker wasn't lying about the boots. Rookie move. Clamping his jaw, he trudged faster up the slippery sidewalk, urged on by a hunger now as wild and ravenous as the proverbial raccoon in a room full of padlocked garbage cans. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" asked a man passing by with his child in tow, both wearing matching Santa caps. Zack's brows arched, and his gaze swung to the endless sweep of blinding whiteness. Were they looking at the same street? Ah, right. The hats. He had a theory about the hats, too. They highlighted a fundamental gap in how folks saw things. While everyone in town counted down the days until Christmas, he was marking time until the day after, when all of the madness stopped, and people no longer did things like outfit their horses as reindeer on their way to the Jingle Bell Jam. Case in point, the 2 Santa-capped Clydesdales harnessed to the wagon in front of Cafe Joy. Man, this town. Tinkling sleigh bells announced his arrival as he pulled open the wreath-adorned door of Cafe Joy. Warmth blasted from the fieldstone fireplace and enveloped his entire body. He nearly whimpered in relief as he stepped inside, ducking a sprig of mistletoe not there 2 days ago and bumping his knee on the potbelly of a plastic Santa freshly added to the mix. One of the few eateries open this time of year, the place wasn't big, but with white lights, snow people, Santas, reindeer, and garlands hanging from the ceiling, it overflowed with exactly the kind of seasonal charm that convinced tourists from all over to brave the frigid temperatures for sleigh rides, caroling, and whatever else they did. The heat was all he needed, and the smells. He sniffed the invisible cloud of cinnamon, hot cocoa, and peppermint swirling. The crazy raccoon in his stomach leapt. "Hey, Dr. Albert," Nova, the owner, said, waving to him from the counter. "Afternoon," he muttered in response, as he unwound his scarf and stomped clumps of snow from the bottoms of his frozen feet onto the season's greetings welcome mat. Hearing himself referred to that way still took some getting used to after years of thinking of his father as the island's only doctor. He hung up his coat and scarf, scanning the room for open seats. Café Joy was that rare breed of establishment so beloved by the locals who saw it as a second living room that they set aside any disdain for flocking day trippers. A handful of men who'd finished the early shift on construction had called first dibs on the stools running along the counter. Retirees there to play cards, and a couple of stay-at-home moms and day trippers had gravitated toward the windows overlooking the snowy street. In addition to the entertainment factor, those spots also offered killer views of the oceanic lake and its white-capped waves. Thankfully, no one had taken his seat at a little table in the corner of the room near the crackling fireplace. "The usual?" Nova asked, already pulling a jumbo roast beef pasty pie from the warming station. "Yep," he said, making his way to the table. He was just beginning to feel his toes again when Nova slid the plate and a mug of hot cocoa, made with real fudge, onto the table before him. One pasty pie and a candy cane fudgy. "Perfect, thanks," he said, feeling that genuine gratitude as he took the warm cup in his grip. He didn't allow himself many vices, but his sweet tooth was something else, and her candy cane cocoa never disappointed. The first velvety sip always reminded him why summer tourists bought blocks of fudge like they were Montezuma's gold. He wiped away the white streaks melting down the cup's side. No matter how many times he asked her to skip the whipped cream, she'd always forget. According to her, Christmas drinks, a must this time of year, weren't Christmas drinks unless they had whipped cream. A burst of laughter caught his attention, and he set the mug on the table. Scanning the cafe in search of the source, he saw the door to the back give a little jump. Once, then twice. The third time, a brunette in a cashmere turtleneck stumbled forward, carrying a ladder in one hand and a big cardboard box in the other. A bright red Santa hat sat crookedly on the top of her head. He swallowed. Hard. Santa hat aside, she was beautiful in an airy, effortless way, her icy blue eyes a stunning contrast to deep brown hair that tumbled down her shoulders in loose waves. He watched her navigate the swaying door. Well, try to. As though magnetized, the corners of everything she carried collided with the frame. Each new bump elicited a giggle, like she was hitting her funny bone instead of mashing a ladder into a doorframe. Her determination charmed him, inspired him actually. And there was something familiar about her lilting laugh and sparkling eyes. Was she... "You want some help, Noelle?" Nova called as she slipped an apple pie into the small turntable fridge. Noelle? That definitely wasn't the name he was thinking. "I think I've got it." Noelle's voice rang bright and clear. Her sparkling gaze landed on him, and for that second, it felt like he was standing next to the sun. She smiled warmly, then scooted the ladder higher on one of the curvy hips she was using to balance her load. The box on the other side slipped. The ladder bumped the frame for the third time, and a loud thud sounded above the Christmas tunes playing from the cafe's small speakers. "Yep, I've definitely got it now." He was pretty sure she didn't have it, but everyone else was so engrossed in their food and conversations, they didn't seem to notice she was 2 steps away from an accident. Normally, nothing short of an emergency would have persuaded him to abandon his observer post in the background. Today, especially, he had the sense that he needed to stay put. Being close to the sun only worked as a metaphor. In real life, it was a surefire way to get scorched, and he didn't need to be a doctor to understand the perils of flames. Yet the helper in him couldn't sit and watch. He set the fork down and stood. "Allow me." Chapter 2. Santa Caps. Zack. Scooping the ladder from her hands, Zack recognized the symptoms of stubbornness. When faced with a choice, the stubborn temperament usually picked the face-saving option and declined help. So he took the choice out of her hands, literally. "Where would you like it?" he asked. Her lips curved in amusement and humor filled her eyes. Had he misjudged her? Maybe everyone didn't have the same aversion to crashing into things that he had. Maybe she didn't. "Over there's good." She pointed to a lit Christmas tree he'd been blocking from his thoughts since he arrived. He put it down. "Anything else you need a hand with?" She chuckled. "I'm sorry, are you laughing at me?" he asked, a flush of self-consciousness adding a hint of rigidity to his spine. She tried to contain her grin, pointing. "You have whipped cream on your nose." "Oh, I see." He drew his finger across his nose, removing the dollop. "Thanks." With anyone else, he'd probably feel like an overused cliché, but that was hard, looking into her kind eyes. "Anytime. Christmas drinks aren't Christmas drinks without the whipped cream," she said in a sing-song voice. "Not you, too?" he asked, stifling a groan and a half-smile. She shook her head. "No, not at all. I'm just poking fun at our girl." Her eyes twinkled and she cast a glance in Nova's direction. "I never get the whipped cream," she whispered conspiratorially. "What's your secret?" he asked. She leaned in, her brow arched. "I don't know. Maybe she thinks I'm sweet enough without it." "What's that supposed to mean?" he challenged, his eyes narrowed in humor. She tilted her head to the side, considering him in a way that made his neck heat. "It means, I bet you have a really nice smile, but I can't be certain because I haven't seen the whole thing." His shoulders relaxed and his lips parted into a full grin. "Yep, I knew it." Her chuckle made him laugh. Whoever she was easy to talk to. It felt as if he'd known her his entire life. Or more accurately, like if he did know her, he'd happily let her light blind him without so much as a blink. Seeing the potential for trouble in his thoughts, he shifted his attention and nudged open the legs of the ladder with his foot. He positioned it next to the base of the tree. "This tree's a beast. Definitely see the need for a ladder." "I'm totally Team Charlie Brown, but when it comes to Christmas trees, go big or go home, that's my motto." She winked. "Charlie Brown?" His brows creased. He didn't get it. "Wow." Her eyes rounded. "The Charlie Brown Christmas show? You didn't watch that as a kid?" "Nope. I guess I missed that bit of early indoctrination." He feigned a cough into his fist. "I mean, rite of passage," he joked. She threw her head back, and her lilting laughter echoed in the space. "Okay, you got me. Christmas is something of a cult in some places, and I, for one, happen to love it." He almost rolled his eyes, but that would have meant taking them off her for 1 second. Instead, he watched the carefree woman in amusement. Still laughing, she gripped an upper rung of the ladder and swung her long leg onto a lower one, wobbling a bit. 1 step later, when he officially decided the wobbling had graduated to a dangerous sway, he tried to hold his hand to the small of her back, but his gesture came too late. She lost her grip on the box and it plummeted to the floor. Thunk. He cringed at the sound of the box's contents clattering and quickly withdrew his hands, not at all sure what to do next. Around the cafe, the buzz dimmed as people threw curious glances their way, as if they hadn't seen 2 people talking before. He rubbed the back of his neck. That wasn't it. They'd never seen him socializing before. "Oops, I think I got a little too excited," she said, bringing his attention back to the box. "Hopefully, nothing inside broke," he said, trying to be encouraging. Then the flaps flopped open, revealing dozens of delicate ornaments. Something was definitely broken. Her gaze followed his, and she shook her head. My feet are always 2 steps ahead of my brain. Or is it the other way around? Either way, one of them needs to slow down. But the quirky smile hadn't left her face. No sense in crying over spilt ornaments, right? I can always make more. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. He admired her optimism, even if he didn't quite share it. He lifted the box onto the platform hanging off the ladder, mildly ashamed at not thinking to do so sooner. "You've got your work cut out for you," he added. She scrunched her nose. "Never really struck me as work." He arched an eyebrow. The tip of the tree beside them peaked almost 2 feet above his head. That tree's got to be at least 8 feet. She just shrugged, her smile never wavering. "I've been known to knock out a dozen in one day." Wow. Decorating was another thing about Christmas he'd never understood. All of that effort for one day? No thanks, although if it meant it'd keep her around, he was cool with it. She cocked her chin to the side, staring with a laser-like intensity that made his scalp tickle. "What happened? You moved away and left your Christmas spirit behind?" He blinked. Who was this woman speaking like she knew him, or was he just that obvious? He stroked the imaginary tingle on his neck again, searching for another topic, then pointed at the tree. "Smells good, like it's straight out of the woods." She beamed. "Farm, actually. It's from Santa's greenhouse." "Oh, yeah, the Christmas tree farm out on the north end of the island?" That farm held a special place in his heart. He rubbed a pine needle between his thumb and forefinger, adding to the woodsy aroma already in the air. "I went to elementary and middle school with a kid whose family owned that farm, Rudolph Christianson. Wonder how he's doing." She plucked a gold ornament from the box, a curious half-smile puzzling her lips. "He's doing very well. He and some of my other brothers are dropping off Christmas trees as we speak. This is the favorite time of year for just about everyone in my family. It's almost like a Christianson requirement if we were ever organized enough to do things like that." She laughed. Zack peered at her, the woman whose eyes and voice were so familiar. Recognition finally dawned. "Melinda Christianson?" "Yes, Zack, it's me. Most people still call me Linda or Mel, but Noelle's my middle name, and some people tease me with it around the holidays." She shot Nova a humorous glance, then turned her sparkling gaze back on him. "I'm surprised you remember me. You were just a kid when you left for boarding school. I heard you took over your dad's practice. Welcome back." Melinda Christianson. The memories clicked into place. 5 years his senior, and the utterly unattainable older sister of his only friend, Linda, had been confident, friendly, down to earth, pretty in a way that made him stare, and his very first crush. 20 years older now, she looked a lot different. Her cheeks had lost the roundness of youth. Perfectly sculpted cheekbones stood in their place. Her long, wavy hair was several shades darker, but that warm, open smile still lit up her entire face. The way she fixed it on him set his heart hammering against his ribs. If he hadn't been a doctor, he might have feared it would bruise. "Thanks. And yeah, I remember you," he said, patting the ladder. "I'm surprised you remember me. I heard you married some hotshot chef and moved to Miami. Are you just back for the holidays?" "The hotshot chef is still in Miami being a hotshot chef, and I'm here for good," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I see," he said, not having the first clue. Were they separated? Divorced? Doing some weird Hollywood separate houses thing? Was there even a smooth way to ask? "Glad to know you didn't forget us. You should stop by sometime. Rudy and my parents would love to see you. You and Rudy were pretty close, right?" "Yeah, we were boys." "He missed you when you moved," she said, hanging an ornament on the tree. "Really?" She nodded. "He always talked about how smart you were. I don't think he finished another one of those models you guys used to work on after you left." Airplanes and cars. That had been their thing, going back to kindergarten when they'd met. It was strange that he'd stopped. But then again, so had Zack. Basketball had much more appeal with the ladies, and at his height, he was a natural. "Yeah, it would be good to catch up," he said. "I'm going to tell him to expect a call from you." "You do that," he said. Rudy was a good dude. The whole humongous family were good people, and the cheerful chaos of their warm country kitchen had been one of the cruelest delights of his childhood. Their house was one of the few places he'd ever really felt a sense of belonging. Interrupted stories and the laughter of the 12 siblings had been lively constants, but he was never allowed to spend as much time there as he would have liked, because homework was the priority in his house, not socializing. She lifted her eyebrows. "Everything okay? You seem a little melancholy." Her inquiry startled him out of his thoughts. "Yeah, fine." "Just taking a quick trip down memory lane?" She nudged, her smile calm and reassuring. He dragged his thumb over his temple. "You're very perceptive?" she asked, adjusting a row of lights on the tree. The soft white light picked up the sheen in her dark hair and deepened the blue in her eyes. He swiveled away from her unsettling gaze. Interacting with her felt like chatting up a fortune teller at a carnival, or worse, sitting on a shrink's couch. "Get used to it. She does it to everyone." Nova approached, another box in tow. Judging by the festive tinsel peeking out, more Christmas decor. Smiling, she laid hers gently down beside the first one. "She says it's from growing up with a house full of people, but we all secretly think she's a bit psychic. She finishes sentences of perfect strangers and always seems to know where you've mislaid your house keys." Smirking, Linda shrugged and pulled at the bottom of her turtleneck. "Not always." "Well, you definitely read me right." He glanced into the fire, somewhat mortified by the admission. Openness wasn't exactly an Albert family trait, but catching her soft gaze again, his gut did a weird flip. He wasn't sure if he wanted to flee or take her in his arms and kiss her senseless. Either way, he might as well have worn a sign, A for awkward. "Well, thanks for helping me," she said, when the silence stretched between them. "I don't want to be the reason you're drinking cold cocoa." "Right." As he was about to sit, a light touch on his arm stopped him. He turned to find Linda holding out an ornament from the tree, the first one she'd lifted from the box and hung. She'd taken it off. "For old time's sake?" She tilted her head at such an adorable angle. The ball of her Santa cap rested on her shoulder. Their eyes locked, and Zack ran his hand over his curls before reaching for the ornament. "Thanks." He ended up paying for his pasty and taking half to go. He had no idea how those powers of perception worked, but he knew he didn't want her to pick up the one huge thought that kept circling in his mind. After all these years, her open smile still took his breath away. That cheerful feeling he'd known in her family's kitchen was there, too, along with a healthy dose of attraction. And the last thing he wanted was to be tempted by someone on Mackinac Island. Yeah, if the cold didn't kill him, those Santas would. Chapter 3, Clubs and Spades, Linda. Voila! Linda slid the last of 3 long golden branches underneath the angel topper, then climbed down the ladder. Clasping her hands behind her back, she circled the freshly dressed Christmas tree and examined her design. Other than compliments and oohs and ahs as the tree decorating had progressed, no one else in the cafe had approached her since Zack had left, allowing her to focus exclusively on getting the job done. Almost exclusively. Her thoughts might have tiptoed back to their conversation a few times. Didn't help that once the door had closed, she'd overheard Maria and Beth at their window seats admiring everything from his cleft chin and broad shoulders to his gait as he'd strode down the snowy sidewalk. But a little curiosity was normal, right? She hadn't seen Zack in almost 20 years. It was natural to wonder what he'd been up to in all that time, to marvel at what had led to his quiet confidence. The cool authority in his voice when he'd taken charge of carrying the ladder was a stark contrast to the shy, bookish boy she remembered hanging out with her kid brother. Her interest meant nothing, though. He was too young for it to mean anything. Talking with him had just been a pleasant surprise. That was all. She tilted her head to the side, spacing a ribbon and 2 ornaments a smidge further away from each other. Perfect. Her happiness bubbled into a smile. The gold balls reflected the white lights and red accents beautifully. The glimmer of the tree and the blaze from the fireplace melded, bathing the room in a warm glow. The slap of a hand hitting the table behind her shook her from her thoughts. She spun around to find Fred Wilson grinning like the Cheshire Cat. His fellow players stared at him, their expressions a portrait of bewilderment, until Vera Moses leaned forward and broke the spell. "What's with the theatrics, Fred?" The old man scratched the line where his silver afro met his temple, then gestured to his cards. "You don't recognize a straight flush when you see it?" A ripple of laughter circled the table. Vera's chuckle was gentle, her aged hand patting his affectionately. "Oh, Fred, that's a mix of clubs and spades. Might be time for a new prescription." He rubbed his eyes and hung his head, feigning embarrassment. Linda stepped over, giving his shoulder a squeeze. "Better luck next hand." He wagged his fluffy salt and pepper brows, a sheepish grin playing on his lips. "You know what they say, 1 minute you're holding all the aces and the next minute you can't remember where you stuck 'em." Linda laughed and her gaze swept the cafe, landing back on the glimmering tree. Honestly, the whole world had been shining since she'd returned to Mackinac. This was the first Christmas she'd been home in 5 years, and she was positively radiant with excitement. Her ex-husband's Michelin-starred restaurant had teemed with people this time of year, and since he'd relied on her to help him run things, she'd never been able to get back home for the holidays. It had always eaten at her something fierce, but like so many things in her old marriage, she'd let it go. Thank goodness that was all behind her. Now all she had to do was figure out what to do next. She'd wasted a decade with a man only to find out in the end that business and late nights with his waitresses were more important than family. Pushing 40, divorced and childless, was not what she'd envisioned for her life. She bent down and closed the flaps on the cardboard box. But there was no place like Mackinac Island to figure things out, especially around the holidays. Starting in October, folks threw open their cupboards and doled out every kind of sweet imaginable. The spirit of generosity was as palpable as any walking, talking member of their small community. This was especially true of her mother and grandmother, who had at least 10 dozen different cookie cutters for each holiday theme. Beyond cookies, they stitched quilts and raised trees, making it their personal mission to ensure that every home in town received some sort of care package. She found herself smiling at the thought and at the feeling of sheer contentment that always filled her this time of year. Would Christmas be her favorite time of year if she'd been born into a different family? One that didn't live for the holiday and the values of sacrifice and love it represented? As she stood, her heart pinched. Had Zack Albert become one of those people? With his straight face and sober demeanor, he'd always come across as someone who didn't appreciate the frivolous things in life. Had the responsibility of taking on his father's practice cemented that? There was definitely a heaviness to him. The luster in his rich brown eyes had dimmed during his trip down memory lane at the end of their talk. Was he reacting to the time of year? The big, unspoken rule in their community was that neighbors looked out for each other, especially around the holidays, which could dredge up difficult emotions in the hardiest people. She'd have to have her brothers go check on him, or maybe she should do it herself. "This is gorgeous. I love it," Nova said, appearing at her side. "Thanks so much for lending me your eye." "You know it's a labor of love." Linda folded up the ladder and walked it to the back room. When she returned, Nova was fingering a small red ceramic bow. Nova looked at her and smiled. "Your love shines from each and every ornament." Linda gave her friend a hug before heading to the door and slipping on her coat. "Here, a candy cane cocoa for the road." Nova pushed a warm container into her hands. Linda inhaled the sweet blend of cocoa and peppermint. It smelled like some of her best childhood memories. "Thank you." She took a sip, then lifted her scarf from the coat rack. Only it wasn't her scarf. She recognized the difference at once. Worn soft from care and love, her red scarf had been wrapped around her neck every winter since her grandmother knit it for her nearly 20 years ago, just before she left for college. This was the same color, but the material had that stiff, brand-new feel, like it had only recently been purchased from a place that sold machine-made clothing. "What's wrong?" Nova asked. "I think Zack accidentally took my scarf." Linda shrugged. "Easy mistake, since they're the same color red." "Ooh, lucky you. I don't think anyone minds a visit to the doctor's office since Zack's taken over." An image of his bronze skin, deep brown eyes, and thick lashes came to mind. Her brother's cute little friend had grown into a full-blown hottie. "He is attractive. Too bad he's 5 years younger than us." Nova tilted her chin. "So what? This is the 90s. Women can date men half their age if they want to, especially dark and brooding doctors so hot they belong in calendars." Linda arched a brow. "I remember him playing with my brother's G.I. Joes. That was over 20 years ago. The man is 6'4" and saves lives for a living. He's not a kid anymore. Besides, a 5-year difference in your 30s is not the same as a 5-year difference in your teens." Linda shook her head. "I'm not so sure about that. Plus, after all those lost years with a chef who was married to his job, the last thing I need is another workaholic, which doctors notoriously are. I don't have any more time to chance on another guy who doesn't know what he wants. I want a family. Soon." Nova nodded, but the glint in her eyes told Linda she wasn't about to yield. "How do you know he's a workaholic or that he doesn't want the same thing as you?" Nova asked. Linda took a sip of her drink. "Fair question. I don't exactly, but I have a sense." Compassion warmed Nova's eyes as she softened her voice. "I know your hunches about people are usually right, but don't you think sometimes it's important to let people show you for themselves?" "She's got a point there," Fred chimed in. Linda almost jumped. She hadn't realized the retirees had stopped chatting, which likely meant they'd heard the entire conversation. "Old hands are just that." He held up his fresh draw and winked for emphasis. "All that matters now is what you're holding this minute, and if it's a good one, you play it." "That's right. My Willie was 7 years younger than me, and we had 60 wonderful years," Vera said. "And I saw the way Zack Albert mooned at you. First time there's been life in those eyes since he's been back on the island." Nova winced and mouthed the word, "sorry." Clearly, she hadn't realized their conversation was loud enough to be overheard either, which was silly considering the cafe's cozy size coupled with the nature of their town. Linda sighed, taking a moment to gaze out of the door at the pristine snow glistening beneath the brilliant blue sky overhead. It was true, though, when it came to understanding others. She had to admit, sometimes the conversations in her head could be a little one-sided. She smiled and held up the scarf, saying, "Of course, you're all right, and I will. But right now, I'm just returning a scarf and getting the one Grandma Shelton knit for me. I'm not thinking of dating him." "Famous last words," Nova said. "Don't you dare try to put thoughts in my head, woman," Linda teased. "Who me? I would never." "I would," Vera called, setting off another round of giggles. As the door closed behind Linda, the group's laughter melded with the tinkling sleigh bells. She trudged through the freshly fallen snow, leaving a trail of footprints behind her. That's also where she tried to leave everyone else's opinions about her love life. While she appreciated their humorous suggestions, it didn't change her feeling that the age difference was a no-go, and not just because her biological clock didn't have a snooze button. In her mind, younger man was also synonymous with commitment phobic, and she'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. Chapter 4. Mrs. Robinson. Linda. Shortly after tying up the horses, Linda stepped inside the lobby of the doctor's office, yanking her gloves off and blowing warm air on her fingertips in quick bursts. Her nose and cheeks were frozen, even though she'd wrapped Zack's scratchy scarf tight around her neck. She slipped it over her head and ran her thumb over the thin fabric. He definitely needed a warmer scarf. This one smelled amazing, though, like chestnut and cloves. Like him. Slow down, Mrs. Robinson. She shook her head, squeezing the scarf and reminding herself of the reason for this visit. The receptionist area appeared empty. Jen, the girl who'd been hired to work his front desk, wasn't in her chair. She was one of a few tourists who'd come for the summer and liked the island so much they'd stayed on permanently. Linda had seen her at her brother's bar a few times. She leaned over the cluttered counter, peeking to see if Jen was around the corner. Nope, nobody. A lonely feeling permeated the small, quiet office. Or maybe it wasn't lonely, just quiet. Oddly quiet. Unlike almost every business, house, and public place at this time of year, no holiday music played. There were no decorations either. She drummed her fingers on the counter. She had 5 other trees to drop off today and was in a hurry to get to them. Neither she nor the horses liked to be on the road after dark. A few minutes passed. No one appeared. She wondered if anyone would. A partially open door separated the lobby from the exam area. Maybe they were in the back. She inched near the door and voices drifted toward her, muffled at first but clearer the closer she got. My friend Sydney still believes in Santa Claus and Christmas miracles. I tell her she's wrong. Do you believe in that stuff, Dr. Albert? A child asked. Laughter followed the question. I don't know. What does your grandpa say? Zack answered. A third voice, gruff with age, joined the conversation. I tell him this is the time of year for stories and gatherings, so the spirit helpers are stronger now. Like us, they draw power from connection. Only one local would give an answer like that. Old Nate, an Ojibwe elder born and raised on the island. The child must be his grandson, Devin. But you're not getting off the hook that easily, Doc, the gravelly voice teased. Whew, do you really need to hear from me after that, Devin? Zack asked. You're a doctor, he insisted. Linda covered her lips with her fingers, stifling a giggle. No pressure there. There was a pause on the other side. She presumed they were waiting for Zack to answer. She was curious, too. Never mind, it was a silly question. I know it's just made up. There's no such thing as miracles. Devin sounded embarrassed. Linda's heart ached for him. She remembered being at that age when the practicality of adulthood threatened the dreamscape of childhood. She prayed Zack's response would keep it at bay for Devin a bit longer, and maybe even echo the wisdom in old Nate's answer. Honestly, kiddo, I don't know. Being a doctor doesn't mean you have all the answers. Now, if you want my opinion about that arm, I can help you there. It wasn't exactly the inspired reply she'd hoped for. They laughed, but there was a smidge of tension in the sound. Seconds later, the trio stepped out of the exam room into the office, the conversation seemingly forgotten. Zack brought up the rear, his gait slow as he scanned his notes. The clipboard rested firmly in his large hands, causing the muscles of his biceps to bulge beneath the fabric of his lab coat. She tried to ignore how her heart stuttered before finding its groove, but it was hard, very hard. Zack Albert had exuded a fair amount of confidence in the cafe. Here, on his own turf, he positively radiated both confidence and composure. There was also something steadying about his presence that patients probably loved. Linda! Zack's eyes rounded slightly. What are you doing here? Is everything okay? I'm fine. She dragged her gaze away from him to rest on Devin's sling. What happened to you, kiddo? Devin looked up bashfully. I fell off a sled with Sydney. It's okay. It doesn't hurt. Zack lowered himself so he was eye level with Devin. You'll let me know if that changes, though, right? Remember what we said? There's no shame in admitting pain. Zack held up his hand for a high five, and Devin smacked it with his unencumbered palm. Other than his awkward answer to the Christmas question, Zack seemed to be good with kids. He had a natural warmth that flowed more easily with them than with adults. Old Nate reached into his back pocket, presumably for his wallet. Zack held up his hand, shaking his head ever so slightly. The older man nodded. They said their goodbyes at the door. Before it closed, Linda stepped forward. Oh, and Devin, she said, smiling at the raven-haired little boy. "I heard your question. Miracles happen every day, especially this time of year. Sometimes we just have to close our eyes to see them." The corner of Devon's mouth quirked up, and his grandfather shut the door behind them, a smile shining in his eyes. "Thanks for the save," Zack said. She turned around, lifting her chin to meet his assessing gaze. He seemed even taller now as they stood alone in his unnervingly quiet office. "Anytime. In the future, feel free to direct all your Christmas questions to me." "Done." He chuckled and glanced at her hands. "Is that my scarf? I thought it felt a lot less scratchy on the way home, and that I smelled something floral." The husky hitch in his voice made her stomach flutter. Had he been as affected by the smell as her? "It is. They must have gotten switched at the cafe," she said. His brow crinkled, and he ran his large hand over his curls, then shook his head. "I'm sorry. My receptionist left 2 weeks ago, and I've been floundering without her, missing things I normally wouldn't miss." "Jen left. What happened?" "She said she couldn't take the cold." His deep voice was firm, matter of fact. Linda could tell he was trying to sound unaffected as he reached behind the door, separating the lobby from his exam rooms, producing her red scarf. "Yeah, we hear that a lot around here, don't we?" she asked, trading scarves with him. He shrugged. "I'm not a cold weather person myself, so I get it." He clapped his hands together. "I tell myself it could be worse, right?" But a flicker of sadness shadowed his eyes, disappearing as quickly as it had come. That had to be tough. He'd only been back a few weeks. She couldn't imagine taking on a new practice with no one to help. She'd heard his father had married the last receptionist, who'd been there for years, and moved to Florida with her. Biting her lip, Linda scrutinized the empty chair behind the counter and the piles of paper on top of the desk. How would he be able to enjoy the season if he was drowning in work? She was tempted to offer a hand, but her schedule was absolutely bonkers with the farm this time of year. "You need a Christmas tree," she finally said. He raised those heavy brows, confusion flashing across his face. "I'm sorry?" "Yeah, you can put a smaller one right there." She pointed to the corner of the counter. "It'll hide some of the, paperwork." He ran his hand over his mouth. "You noticed that, did you? You don't miss a thing." It wasn't the kind of comment one answered, so she didn't. "And another one here. Bigger. About my height," she said, using her arms to indicate height and width. "2 Christmas trees now." She detected humor in his tone. "I don't think the space is really big enough for 3, but we could go for it if you want," she teased before grasping the doorknob. "Go for it." "No. Wait, where are you going?" he asked. "Outside, to get your trees." She motioned with her free thumb. His expression shifted from surprise to humor, the corners of his eyes crinkling into a faint smile. "You brought Christmas trees with you. Like, here's your scarf, and oh hey, why not have a Christmas tree or 2 while you're at it?" "Exactly. Your first miracle. By the way, if I'm not around the next time a kid asks you about Christmas miracles, the answer is an unequivocal yes. Okay?" He laughed, a full, deep laugh that sent a warm rush of awareness through her. "I'm still stuck on the fact that you brought Christmas trees with you to return my scarf," he said. "Don't be. That's the Christiansons' gift to the island. I just dropped off Nova's when I ran into you at the cafe, and I have 5 more to hand out today. We offer them to all the businesses." "That's very generous of your family." He paused and twisted his lip. "My dad never had a Christmas tree in the lobby." She lifted one shoulder and promptly let it fall. "Not everyone wanted one. Somehow I sensed you two differ on more than a few things." "You sure you aren't a mind reader?" The right corner of his lip inched up a bit at the same time. Another shadow flashed across his eyes. "Sorry. One downfall of living in a big family. Airtime can be limited, so I tend to just blurt as soon as the thoughts come to my head. I shouldn't have said that." No, your honesty and accuracy are scarily refreshing." He rubbed the back of his neck, then leaned against the counter with his arms folded over his chest. "Good. Then it's settled. She didn't wait for a confirmation on the trees because she was pretty sure he was the type of person who had a hard time accepting gifts, and 100% sure that he'd feel much better with cheerfully decorated trees in his lobby. She opened the office door, nearly tripping as she stepped forward. In fact, if not for his swift reflexes, she would have gone down. "Oh!" she exclaimed when he pulled her toward him, while her feet scrambled to avoid trampling the cardboard box that had appeared in front of the door. His grip was strong, yet gentle, and warm enough to send heat rippling through her turtleneck up her arms, past her shoulders, and straight to the tips of her ears. But his touch was forgotten when a yelp came from the box and she saw a blanket twitch. "What do we have here?" She crouched, hesitating for one brief moment, worried about what she might find on the other side of that blanket. But when it yelped again, her heart wouldn't let her wait any longer. She flipped it back. 3 little puppies huddled together in the center of the box looking up at her. "Oh my goodness, you precious things. How did you get here?" Gently lifting a bundle of soft brown fur, she felt Zack settle beside her. "Here, take one," she said, holding a puppy in front of Zack's chest. Zack shook his head stubbornly and his hands stayed pressed to his knees. "I can't. I don't know what to do." Was he scared to hold a puppy? She smiled and gently pried his palms from his body, then cradled them to his chest in an L shape. "It's as natural as holding a baby." "Babies don't bite," he said. "It wouldn't hurt if these guys did." She put the first puppy in the shelf she'd made of his arm. "See? Nothing to it." When he didn't exactly protest, she tucked the second one in the other arm as she held the third. "Come on, we've got to get them inside. It's way too cold for them to be outdoors." "They can't come in here. It's a doctor's office, which is probably why my dad never brought trees in. People have allergies." She stood, scooting around him with her puppy and walking into the office, second-guessing herself with every step. He had a good point, and she hoped for both their sakes she could come up with a better one. Because even though she could try to ask one of her siblings, she was pretty sure Zack Albert needed these puppies as much as they needed him. Chapter 5. Nip and Wiggle. Zack. Zack's internal red button was blinking fast and furious. This uncharted territory felt dangerous, or at least unnerving. Holding a puppy in each hand, he used his toe to nudge the door closed behind Linda and himself. He'd never held a puppy before, and the warm office air must have breathed fresh life into the small animals. The one in his left hand wiggled like he'd had too much espresso. He feared he might drop it. Thankfully, the one in his right just nestled deeper into the crook of his arm, spreading reluctant warmth into Zack's chest. He slid down into the nearest waiting room chair. "I can't have these in the office." "Says who?" Linda's full lips jutted defiantly, and she looked around the empty office as if for emphasis. Mr. Espresso continued to nip and wiggle. Placing his paws on Zack's chest, he covered his chin with a series of cold, wet licks, which made Zack grimace. Laughing hysterically, Linda finally took mercy and plucked the rambunctious guy from his arms, so he was left holding only the snoozing heater against his chest. Amusement threatened his resolve as he watched her let the mini Tasmanian devil climb halfway up her shoulder and nuzzle into the delicate base of her neck. "I'm pretty sure dog therapy is a thing," she said, tilting her head slightly to accommodate the dog, clearly unfazed. "Not in doctors' offices." "I've seen therapy dogs in hospitals," she said, petting both dogs. "That's still not a doctor's office." Rolling her eyes, she eased into the seat beside him. "Right, Mr. Difficult. And you can't keep them on account of allergies. I heard you, but it's a small island and I'm pretty sure we can find a workaround." Keep? A workaround? Was this woman not hearing him? No. There is no keeping, and there is no workaround. "They look like collie mixes. Do you think they're okay?" she asked, clearly ignoring him and squinting into the face of the one in her hands. The tender way she stroked the dogs and cooed at them pulled his heartstrings. He sighed. "Breathing is stable. Their body temperatures feel regular. That's a good sign." Linda shifted her gaze from the tawny-colored puppy she'd been snuggling against her cheek to Zack. It is a good sign. An excellent sign. Oh. Her tone was cryptic. Her jaw set. This woman was a force, and he was pretty sure her psychic powers were contagious because he had a strong sense she was about to try and draft him into the canine adoption business, courtesy of fate or the universe or Father Christmas himself. Regardless, the answer was no. Her attention returned to the puppy. It watched her with mild curiosity, one ear up and the other down. This white patch of fur around his eye is shaped like a heart. Isn't it cute? He shrugged. They were all cute. That wasn't the problem, nor was it what he'd expected her to say. I think we should name him Cupid. That sounds like a very bad idea to me, he said, frowning. Why? You've got something against the god of love? She teased. They aren't ours to name. She bit her lip. I'll help you. Help me? He asked, fully aware that confusion had lifted the volume of his normally calm voice. She nodded at the stack of papers on the desk. With all that? She gestured. Had that stack gotten taller? Wider? It definitely looked larger than it had this morning, and the red light on the answering machine was blinking angrily. His head throbbed. Administration definitely wasn't his forte. I'll step in for Jen. I couldn't possibly take your help. He shook his head. Why? Because more than half your clients pay in trade and you don't think you can afford me? You saw the thing with old Nate? She nodded. He sighed. Of course she had. Honestly, his former assistant had done both of them a favor when she'd left, in a way. Between her salary and the money his father took, there wasn't much left at the end of the month, which was why he still lived in the cramped space above the office. Clients came, but not nearly as many as had come when his father had run the practice. They were leery of him, leery of his age. Rather than be seen by someone younger than them, many took the ferry to the mainland. That's part of it, he admitted. The other part was her. She unnerved him. How could he focus on building the practice and protect his mind from the beautiful woman's intrusive powers of perception? His brain worked well, but not that well. Then there was Vanessa Miro. Sure, she'd told him she didn't want to be bogged down by a relationship as she built her career, but he hoped when he went back to Atlanta in a year, enough time would have passed for her to reconsider. Linda's bright eyes slid from his back to the stack of papers. Consider it my Christmas gift to you. No way. Not happening. She scooted closer to him. I'll help you out until you find someone new. Just twice a week or so, and I'll help you find homes for the puppies. No. 3 times a week. This is not a negotiation. I can't run this practice and look after these puppies. Since you run this practice, you are the perfect person to look after these puppies. That's probably why someone left them on your doorstep. Puppies and humans are different. Thus the distinction between a doctor and a vet. She fixed her gaze on him and blinked twice, letting the last note of his condescending tone hang between them like the bitter aftertaste of a sour lemon. I'm sorry, he said, shifting in his seat. I shouldn't have spoken that way to you, but I know nothing about dogs. Her eyes softened. You didn't have pets growing up? He shook his head. That's too bad. No pets, no brothers and sisters, she said gently. It was fine. Good, actually. Allowed me to focus on my studies. His voice was tighter than he would have liked. She raised her eyebrows but said nothing, obviously holding herself back for what she thought was his benefit. Irritation pricked the back of his neck. He felt like he was looking at someone who decided not to puncture another's lie. And it was a lie, one that he did his best not to examine. Revealing that particular weakness made him feel defenseless, although she didn't seem like a judgy person. The pooch in his arms let out another small yelp, then promptly bit down on Zack's thumb. Ouch! The dog's teeth were pointy like little needles. If this was what it meant to have a pet, maybe he hadn't missed out on anything. Going back to the whole vet thing, he started. She gave him a stern look, or at least she tried to. The tiny crinkles fanning the edges of her eyes betrayed her. "Too soon," he deadpanned. "Go ahead, speak your piece," she said, breaking into a full smile and rubbing her hand across each dog's back. "Why don't you take them there?" She regarded at him with that sweet, musing expression, like he was an alien come down from Mars. "Dr. Sampson's daughter gave birth last week. She's on the mainland helping out for the next 2 weeks. If I took these guys to the vet, they might end up at a shelter off island." "Oh," that explained the look. "I didn't know she was gone. I don't keep up with everyone's comings and goings." He pulled at the collar of his sweater, then ran his hand over his curls. A shelter? Even he couldn't stomach that possibility. "I suppose you want me to keep them beneath the Christmas tree?" he asked, joking. Her eyes lit up, and he instantly regretted saying anything. Why had he reminded her about the tree? "That's a great idea," she said, thrusting the 2 puppies back into his arms. "I'll be right back." "Wait, what are you doing?" he called as she ran back into the cold. The only answer was the door snapping shut behind her. Yeah, those so-called psychic powers were unquestionably contagious because he knew the answer to this question, too. What was she doing? She was bringing a heaping helping of that cheerful Christianson chaos right into the Albert family practice. Trouble was, he didn't have the first clue what to do about it. Chapter 6, Choice Cut. Linda unlatched the back of the wagon, her gaze flitting to the horses. They seemed content, but she worried they would soon get cold. She would have to skip a few drop-offs today to get them back to the barn to warm up. As she sifted through the trees in the wagon bed, a wave of concern washed over her. Was she coming on too strong? Being the eldest of 12 had its drawbacks. On the one hand, helping her mother raise her siblings had given her a front-row seat to the development of 11 distinct personalities. Actually, more like 1,000, because most people were really their own small collectives. At any rate, they had definitely helped advance her understanding of the human psyche. She could usually tell what folks were thinking and feeling at a glance, but her sibling role had also led to one of her fatal flaws: pushiness. Organizing the lives of everyone around her was her love language. Unfortunately, sometimes her idea of what was best for others clashed with their own ideas. Outside of her family, who tolerated her with humor, others had been turned off by what she considered helpfulness, as her ex used to like to remind her, repeatedly. She didn't want Zack to be another casualty, not only because she enjoyed the peaceful feeling she experienced in his presence, but because she really was trying to turn a corner. She bit her lip. With 11 siblings, surely one of them would take the puppies. Although, like her, most were impossibly busy with the farm right now. And Zack was all alone. 3 puppies were a lot of work, absolutely. But they would also be a bundle of love. And he'd seemed so sad. Not obviously sad, but it was there, hovering just beneath the surface of all that strength and old-school masculinity. He really seemed like he could use the extra joy. Maybe whoever had dropped them off had noticed the same thing. Grabbing the stump of a shorter pine, Linda pulled it toward her, worry manifesting in her haste. If Zack still seemed reluctant when she brought it in, one of her siblings was going to have to make good on an outstanding favor. Before she could free the tree, 2 hands joined hers, lightening the load considerably. Zack stood by her side. "Changed your mind?" she asked. "Seems like it." She thought about offering him an out, but decided he was joking. He wasn't the go-along to get along type. He studied her, his expression serious and contemplative, except for the hint of a grin winking at the corners of his warm brown eyes. They reminded her of rich chocolate, and she tried not to look away when a flash of attraction raced hot through her blood. His smile deepened, and for 1 second, she wondered if the tables had turned. Could he tell what she was thinking? He glanced at the horses, and his smile turned into a laugh. She smirked. "Okay, now it's my turn to ask. Are you laughing at me, Doc?" Zack arched a brow. "I noticed your wagon at the cafe. What's the deal with their outfits?" Linda chuckled. You don't like their outfits? Do you think they like them? Of course. She nodded to the matching red skirts around their necks, embroidered with big white snowflakes. They're the height of Christmas fashion in the horse world, and no mare worth her hay would ever be seen out and about without her winter green leg warmers. He laughed, and his cleft winked. It was chin-credible. What are you doing out here anyway? You're not even wearing a jacket, she said, trying to sober her thoughts with the question. You didn't honestly think I'd let you carry 2 trees by yourself, did you? He asked, every bit the Southern gentleman. I could have managed, she said, silently reminding herself once again of their age difference. I have no doubt you would have. His tone was kind and velvety. But why settle for managing when you've got someone to help lighten the load? He gave her a cocky half-smile, and suddenly it didn't feel so cold outside anymore. Age difference or no, she decided she was okay with having his help when she didn't exactly need it. Well, thank you for coming out here to freeze with me. Still holding the end of the tree, she grabbed one of the metal buckets filled with gardening foam they'd use as a stand and followed him into the office. It took them less than 5 minutes to set the spruce up on the counter and about the same amount of time for the area to smell as fresh as the land where it had been grown. He shoved his hands in his pockets. Okay, maybe you're onto something. It is kind of amazing how one little change can have such a big impact. It smells different in here, and it feels different too. You didn't sneak in one of those fur-scented candles, did you? Ah, that was awfully close to 2 of her favorite words. You're right. Linda tried not to smile, but she couldn't help herself. Would it be too much to call this your first Christmas miracle of the season? He shot her a look and held her gaze for such a long time, she thought maybe he'd forgotten he was staring at her. Just as she was about to wave her hand in front of his face, he shook his head, as though coming out of a trance. Nah, but me agreeing to your wild idea just might be, he said. A flush of warmth crept up her cheeks. Really? Before she knew it, she'd gone up on her tiptoes and wrapped her arms around his neck. She quickly pulled herself away. Oops, sorry about that. I got a little carried away. It's okay, he said. Beats a thank you card. She turned away, hoping to compose the emotions she was sure played too freely across her face, and cast her eyes to the box where the puppies lay snuggled together in a small mound of fur. You're going to keep them? He folded his arms across his chest and surveyed the lobby. The faint light in the room seemed to add years to his face. I took this practice over a month ago. The number of patients walking through that door is down 50% from this time last year. Nothing has changed but the person who's running it. People don't see a doctor when they look at me. They see a kid and an outsider. Her heart ached for him. Without a doubt, his age was a deterrent for some. A pang of guilt gnawed at her. She wasn't any different, was she? She'd been measuring by his year of birth all day. And you think puppies might bring people in, make them trust you? He looked away for a moment, his lips pressed into a flat line. They're great marketing. Ever notice how the Super Bowl ads are always stuffed with them? Linda's heart sank. So you're using the puppies as what? A prop to fit in? He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Can't blame a guy for trying to bridge the gap. I mean, don't worry. If it works, they'll get their cut. She shook her head. They better get the choice cut regardless, and love, too. His expression softened. Of course. Of course. Look, you wanted me to take them. I'm taking them. You're right. She looked at him, at the puppies, then back to his eyes, torn between the memories of a kind-hearted boy and the businessman/doctor standing before her now. I've got some more trees to deliver, she finally managed. She jotted down some care instructions for the puppies, and as she stepped out into the cold, one niggling thought lingered. Was the island's newest doctor also the newest Grinch? Chapter 7. Cupid's Paw. Zack. A high-pitched yelp woke Zack from a state that wasn't quite slumber, but wasn't wakefulness either, making opening his eyes a feat of will. When he finally did, at the second yelp,